From the News Channel 5 Network, this is MorningLine.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. I'm Nick Barris. It's Wednesday. We have a good show. By the way, again, you know, I'd been off the last couple of weeks. We're back now, and this is a live show. You can call in, join in the conversation. And I know, actually, prior to me leaving, we had a few programs where folks had come in on the phone asking questions about malpractice cases, you know, and it didn't really tie in with some of the guests we had at the time, but I said if you hang on to those questions, call in, because Clint Kelly, our malpractice attorney, is going to be joining us. So if you're watching this morning, now's your chance to call in, and we'll take those as soon as we can, because, yeah, he's right here. Clint Kelly, good morning to you.
Good morning to you.
It's nice to see you, my friend.
Nice to see you.
It's been a while. We've been out and about and back in the saddle this morning. And
it's been too long.
But, yeah, it has. It's good to have him on. The number is 737-7587. As you know, he is an attorney who specializes in malpractice, you know, dealing with hospitals, doctors, and the like. And just going to ask you these days, as you peruse the news and anything along those lines, what's happening in the law. Anything you want to touch base? Is anything new on the horizon right now? Any cases that caught your eye that... Sometimes there's high-profile ones involving, you know, celebrities and the like. Anything really jump out at you?
Not really, Nick.
Class
I checked
action?
around. You know, there's always some drug cases that you can check up on. People see those on the commercials, but I was looking to see if there was a high-profile malpractice case involving celebrities or something along that line. I didn't find it.
Haven't seen one. I mean, the last one that we thought might develop into a malpractice case was the death of Bill Paxton.
Correct.
Okay, and I don't know that we've still heard one way or the other. I don't believe any lawsuit has been filed, but remember, he died after a routine type surgery that surprised a lot of people. You know, Bill Paxton, the actor from like Twister and that, died of a stroke, right?
Right.
And this is something you've been harping on the last several times you've been on, the new procedures that they're supposed to take to prevent that.
Strokes and in particular blood clots.
Yeah. See, this is another reason I love having you on. I learned so much. The bottom line on that is if you're going to be on a hospital bed and not moving for a while and have surgery like that, they need to put pressure packs on your legs and elsewhere to prevent strokes from forming?
Correct. If you're going to be immobilized, meaning you're going to be off your feet for long periods of time where, you know, the blood's not going to flow through your legs like it should, the first line of defense is they will put these pneumatic compression devices on your legs to squeeze your legs to keep the blood circulating. The best defense is what's called heparin. It's a shot that they give you in the abdomen. It's basically a blood thinner, and they use that in so-called high-risk patients. And it's very, very important these days to make sure that patients get blood clot prevention, because if you get one in the hospital and it travels to your lungs, it can kill you. Yeah,
and we've seen that in a few cases, and it can lead to lawsuits.
I had a case just like that that came from this show where
just
young man had a blood clot.
Just awful. One other thing, I was talking to him about this at the beginning of the program. It just hit me this morning driving in as we continue to see some of these news stories about scabies in one of the local, you know, jail facilities here, and then it kind of brought up the question too of treatment of inmates if they get sick and if they're not getting proper treatment behind, you know, bars. And I'm just curious, can inmates ever sue for malpractice if the medical care behind bars doesn't do what it should? And I would imagine there's problems pursuing those cases just because they're behind bars.
Well, they do have the right to bring a claim. They can bring it against the governmental entity that runs the prison.
Okay.
Say, for example, if someone died here in a metro jail from inadequate medical care, you would bring a case against the metropolitan government.
Right.
You wouldn't have a jury. It'd be a trial judge that would hear the case, and there's a $300,000 cap on what the patient can recover. There's a practical difficulty in bringing cases for inmates simply because of the standard of care is a basic level of care that inmates are supposed to get, but a lot of times there's only so much medical service that can go around in jails.
Right.
So they're hard cases.
Yeah, I was going to say, because there's limits to that.
Correct.
So when you talk about caps, by the way, when you say 300,000, there are caps on how much you can sue any municipality, aren't there?
That's correct. $300,000.
Okay,
Tennessee.
And it's different if you're suing a private entity as opposed to a public?
That's right. If you sue a private entity, the only cap that you would be subjected to is the tort reform cap of $750,000 on non-economic damages. But if you sue a governmental entity, including the state of Tennessee, by law, the damages are limited to $300,000 unless there's a civil rights violation. In that case, it would be different. But a medical negligence case, you're going to be looking at a $300,000 cap.
All right, let's cover some of the basics as we always do. The number 737-7587. We can take some calls as we get to the next segment if you want to join us. But just for folks maybe sitting out there wondering, all right, I'm trying to think. I've been to the doctor. I haven't had this happen to me before. Is something wrong? What are the questions someone, again, should ask themselves if they're wondering whether or not they may be victim of malpractice? What kind of yeses do they have to get to say, yeah, I think I'll call an attorney? Well,
first, Nick, a medical malpractice case is basically two things. Okay. It's a major medical mistake followed by a major medical injury. And what patients or family members typically ask themselves is, and it's kind of a gut reaction, has something been screwed up? Has the care been inadequate? Wrong medication? Have nurses or physicians not followed up and taken care of a patient, or has a really unexpected outcome occurred? I've told you many times that if a patient is under 50 years old and dies in the hospital after having been hospitalized, I investigate that case uniformly.
You're just saying that shouldn't happen?
It is. It is unexpected. Now, that's not to say sometimes people die and they get good medical care, because doctors do the best they can. But someone that young who dies in a hospital, I'm suspicious, because you're really not supposed to die at a hospital in modern times at that age unless there is a major problem with you where you are subject to potentially dying from a complication.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So that would be it. We need to remind folks too, part of the problem is we're not doctors ourselves. So the suspicion, and you deal with these clients all the time that call you, I guess the key is if you have some inkling as to something's odd here, but you don't know for sure, just make the call, right?
Absolutely. Okay. The call's free, and you can get an opinion from one of my experts. If I believe the case has merit and it's worth investigating, I'll have a medical expert look at the case after Nurse Kathy does her evaluation. And we've talked about Nurse Kathy. She's my screener. And she looks at all the cases that I believe are worth investigating, and then a medical expert will give an opinion as to whether or not the case should go forward. But it's amazing how patients and family members have a unique sixth sense. They really do, Nick, and all
like
of us
something's
do.
just not right here.
Yeah.
I guess you do. I mean, knock on wood, I've not been in that situation with myself or a loved one. And I wonder if I'd feel that. Meaning, if you go in, most of us go in hoping for a positive result, okay? And one thing I've learned from you is that the bottom line is doctors aren't miracle workers. Sometimes they can only do so much. But it has to be standard of care. How do I know whether or not that doctor's actually lived up to the standard of care? Which, if they haven't, I probably have a case, right?
Yeah, more likely than not, the patient or the family member is not going to know whether the standard of care was violated, except, classic example.
Okay.
Nurse gives the patient the wrong drug. Come on. If the doctor operates on the wrong body part, which happens more often than you think, I've got a few of those cases, that's obvious. But in terms of actual care, treatment options, complications, and whether they're managed properly, the patient's not going to be able to know that. You're going to need a medical expert to give an opinion on that.
Okay, well, like Clint said, if you've got just that gut feeling, it's almost a sixth sense that something is wrong. And by the way, we'll have his number up throughout the program, but the key on this, if you suspect it, make the call. And one big reason for that is, real quick before we go to our first break, statute of limitations.
Statute of limitations is 1 year from the date that the patient discovers the injury. That's when the clock starts ticking. And so, as I've always said on this show, don't wait. Pick up the phone and call. It costs you nothing, and it may make the difference between you having a case and not getting your day in court because you waited too long.
Yeah, I know for a fact that you've told me in the past you've had cases that came through the door and you said, yeah, we've got a good case. When did it happen? And it was 14 months ago.
It's a painful conversation every time I have to tell the patient, sorry, you waited too long.
Yeah, don't wait. Let's take one call before we go to break. We'll go to Steve. Steve, good morning.
Yes, I have a question, and it was about the limitations.
Yeah.
We had a failed transition coming out of the hospital once, but it was more than a year ago. And how do you go about, like, if you just have a general feeling that you got just continuously bad care, what's the procedure for that?
Well, that's a great question, Steve. First of all, the law says that once the patient discovers the cause of action, in other words, suspects something's gone wrong and connects it to an injury, that's when the clock starts ticking.
Okay.
But if you suspect something, Steve, you just pick up the phone, you can call me or another malpractice lawyer and say, look, here's what happened. I would like to have this case looked at. Do I have a case?
Right. Steve, have you ever looked into any of that? Have you talked to an attorney?
I haven't talked to an attorney, but I did ask for her medical records from the hospital, and they agreed to do them, to send them off for someone to look at them, and then they never did it. And there was a lot of complications. She was still in the hospital. I was concerned more about her feeling all right and her having confidence in the medical team that was working on her. But now that we're a while later, I mean, yeah, I have all sorts of questions. She's suffering a lot that they never mentioned. There are a lot of things that she's going through today that were never part of the conversation before the surgeries.
Well, and the key thing, Nick, that needs to be mentioned here is the case needs to involve a serious major medical injury, whether it's a death, loss of a limb, brain injury, like I said, a blood clot that causes perhaps an amputation or death. The injury needs to be really substantial to get a jury to want to compensate, because if the injury is minor, and of course that can sometimes be in the eye of the beholder, juries just aren't compelled to compensate. That's an attitude. We live in the age of the Trump juror where it's get over it.
Yeah, just get over it. It is. But the key, and when he said getting the medical records, they're going to provide that, how important is that? I mean, you're able to pursue them sometimes yourself, but as a patient, you should be able to request your medical records.
Well, I'll tell Steve and everybody else, you have a right by law to get your medical records.
And if they haven't sent them to him after he requests.
That's correct. If they haven't sent them to you, by the way, the statute of limitations will be extended for a period of time that you're not getting your medical records if you've asked for them. And then I can get the medical records, and if I have to sue to get them, I will.
Good. Okay, so that's something good for Steve to know, because if it goes back a while, you know, more than a year with whatever the procedure was, if he hasn't gotten his records, then that can mean he's within his statute.
Because how can you necessarily discover and file your lawsuit if you don't have the medical records?
Gotcha. All right, let's take a break on that note. Steve, thanks for the call. Others on hold, Tommy, stay there. The number 737-7587. He's Clint Kelly. We'll continue our conversation, taking your calls, questions about malpractice and the like, right after this. Stay with us.